Welcome to the world of science fiction where extraordinary tales come to life. Enjoy the journey. The air inside the Draxan Imperium slave transport reeked of sweat, fear, and the metallic tang of blood. Kel Varric pressed his back against the rusted wall of his cell, the shackles around his wrists cutting deep. He wasn't supposed to be here. A former Terran Union soldier, court-martialed for disobeying orders. Now just another piece of cargo in the galaxy's cruelest trade. Across the dim mold, a figure stirred. She was alien, delicate, with skin like polished silver and eyes that glowed faintly amber. But what caught Cal's attention was the mark on her forearm. A pulsing, bioluminescent brand, woven into her very DNA. A Draxan ownership sigil. The ship lurched violently. Alarms blared. "We're under attack." A guard shouted before a plasma blast turned him to ash. The alien girl's chains clattered to the floor, deactivated. She didn't run. Instead, she locked eyes with Kale. "You're human," she said, voice like wind chimes. "They say your kind resists." Kale smirked, snapping his own restraints. "Yeah, we're stubborn like that." She extended a hand. "I'm Lyra. And if you help me, I'll show you why the Draxan fear us both." The escape pod hissed open. Behind them, the slave ship burned. Ahead, only the void. And a war waiting to be lit. The escape pod shuddered as it broke through Vexus's atmosphere, its heat shields glowing orange. Kale gripped the controls, his knuckles white. Behind him, Lyra sat perfectly still, her luminous eyes fixed on the planet below. A sprawling, neon-lit junkyard of a world where law meant nothing and survival meant everything. "You sure this is the place?" Kale asked, eyeing the flickering navigation screen. Lyra didn't blink. "The Draxan won't look for us here. Vexus is unpleasant, but it's free." Kale snorted. "Yeah, freezing, toxic, and full of pirates. Real paradise." The pod slammed into a landing pad, sending sparks flying. Outside, the air smelled like burnt fuel and rotting synth meat. A group of rough-looking traders turned to stare, their hands drifting toward weapons. Kale stepped out first, his pulse pistol loose at his side, just enough to remind them he wasn't prey. Lyra followed, her silver skin shimmering under the planet's sickly yellow sun. The moment her foot touched the ground, a hush fell. Aliens of a dozen species froze mid-step, their eyes locked onto her. "They recognize the brand," she murmured. Kale tensed. "How bad is that?" "Depends how much they fear the Draxan." A hulking Vrexian stepped forward, his forearms crossed. "You bring trouble to my port, human." "Not looking for trouble," Kale said evenly. "Just passage off-world." The Vrexian's laugh was a low rumble. "Slave runners pay well for marked ones." Cal's finger hovered over the pistol's trigger. "Try it." Silence. Then, "Cal Varric." The voice came from the shadows. A figure stepped forward, hooded, face hidden, but the way they moved was unmistakably human. "You're supposed to be dead," the stranger said. Cal's blood ran cold. "Joran?" The hood fell back, revealing a face he hadn't seen in years. Joran Cade, his old squadmate from the Terran Union. But the man he remembered was gone. This one had a Draxan bounty chip embedded in his temple. "You shouldn't have come here," Joran said. "They're already hunting you." Lyra's hand found Cal's arm. "Who is he?" "An old friend," Cal muttered. "Or a trap." Joran's gaze flicked to Lyra, then back. "You always did pick the worst fights. Come with me. Unless you want the whole port shooting at you in 5 minutes." The safe house was a crumbling bunker beneath the city, stinking of damp metal and stale rations. Joran poured 3 glasses of something that smelled like engine coolant. "Draxan put a kill order on both of you," he said, tossing a holopad onto the table. Their faces flashed above it. "Wanted. Alive. That brand of hers. They don't lose property." Lyra touched her forearm, the mark pulsing faintly. "It's more than that." It's a tracker. And a kill switch. Cal's stomach dropped. What? If they can't reclaim me, they'll terminate me. Joran leaned forward. There's a scientist, Silas Moore, worked for the Draxan before he defected. Rumor is he knows how to break their genetic locks. Where? Cal demanded. The Black Zone. Asteroid belt near Krill. No laws, no patrols, just mercs and madmen. Lyra stood abruptly. Then we go. Cal didn't move. Why help us, Joran? Last I heard, you were working for the highest bidder. Joran's smile didn't reach his eyes. Maybe I'm tired of seeing humans kneel. Outside, the distant hum of ships grew louder. Too loud. Joran's holopad beeped, a proximity alert. They're here. Cal grabbed Lyra's wrist. Back door. Now. The first explosion rocked the bunker as they fled into the tunnels. Behind them, Joran's voice echoed. Find more. And Cal, don't trust anyone. The last thing Cal saw was the flash of Draxan armor pouring into the safe house before the tunnel collapsed behind them, sealing their fate, and their only ally, in rubble. Lyra's breath was ragged beside him. What now? Cal checked his pistol. 1 round left. Now we steal a ship. Somewhere above them, the hunters closed in. The stolen freighter rattled as it pierced the outer debris field of the Black Zone, its shields flaring against the jagged remnants of dead asteroids. Cal clenched his jaw, wrestling with the controls. The ship was a piece of junk. No weapons, half its thrusters misfiring. But it had gotten them this far. Lyra stood behind him, her fingers gripping the back of his seat. The dim glow of the brand on her arm pulsed in time with her breathing, a constant reminder of the clock ticking against them. You sure this is the right place? Cal muttered, eyeing the scanner. The asteroid belt was a graveyard of wrecked ships and forgotten outposts. It has to be, Lyra said softly. No one comes here unless they have no other choice. A signal flickered on the comms. Weak, encrypted. Cal tapped it open. Static hissed, then a voice, dry as dust. Turn back, or don't. The dead don't care either way. Cal exchanged a glance with Lyra. We're looking for Dr. Moore. A pause. Then, who's asking? Someone who doesn't want to die today. Cal shot back. The line crackled. Docking Bay 47. And if you're Draxan, save us both the trouble and shoot yourselves now. The station was worse up close. Rust streaked its hull like old blood, and the docking clamps groaned as they locked on. Cal checked his pistol, still just that 1 round, and stepped out first. The air inside was thick with the stench of ozone and something sour. The corridor ahead was littered with discarded equipment, its walls scared from gunfire. Then the shadows moved. A dozen figures emerged, weapons trained on them. Not Draxan. Scavengers, their faces hidden behind patched helmets. Well, one sneered, looks like payday came early. Cal didn't flinch. We're here for more. Everyone's here for something, the scavenger said, stepping closer. But you're here for a bullet. Lyra's hand tightened on Cal's arm. Then, enough. The voice came from the far end of the corridor. A man stood there, gaunt, his coat hanging off his frame like a shroud. His eyes were sunken, but sharp. Let them pass. The scavengers hesitated. You deaf? The man snapped. Move. Grudgingly, they lowered their weapons. Cal exhaled. Dr. Moore, I assume. The man turned without answering and walked away. Moore's lab was a nightmare of spliced wires and humming machines, the air thick with the acrid smell of chemicals. He dropped into a chair, gesturing for them to sit. You're either very brave or very stupid, he said. Which is it? Desperate, Lyra said, rolling up her sleeve. The brand gleamed under the lab's harsh light. Moore went still. Then, slowly, he reached out, tracing the mark with a trembling finger. Ah, he murmured. So they're still doing this. Can you remove it? Kale demanded. Moore leaned back. It's not just a tracker. It's woven into her DNA. Mess with it, and it triggers a cascade failure in her nervous system. Poetic, isn't it? The Draxon's idea of insurance. Lyra's face paled. Then there's no way. I didn't say that. Moore stood, pacing. There's a flaw. A backdoor. The brand was designed to respond to Draxon genetic markers. But humans? Your DNA is different. Chaotic. Unpredictable. He smirked. It's why they hate you. Kale frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying, Moore said, that if we splice human genetic material into her system, it might confuse the brand long enough to disable it. Lyra's eyes widened. You want to use his blood. Not just blood, Moore corrected. Neural patterns, a direct transfer. It'll hurt. Both of you. Kale didn't hesitate. Do it. The machine was cold against his skin as Moore attached the nodes to his temples. Lyra lay beside him, her breath shallow. Ready? Moore asked. Kale reached over, gripping Lyra's hand. Always. The pain was instant, white-hot, like his veins were on fire. He heard Lyra gasp beside him, her fingers crushing his. The machine whined, its lights flickering wildly. Then, silence. Kale opened his eyes. Lyra sat up slowly, staring at her arm. The brand was still there, but it wasn't glowing. Moore let out a shaky laugh. Well, that's something. Outside, the station shuddered. An alarm blared. They're here, Moore said quietly. Kale was on his feet in an instant. Draxon. Who else? Moore tossed him a rifle. I'd wish you luck, but we're all past that. The first explosion rocked the station as they ran for the docks. The station shook under the force of another explosion, sending sparks raining from the ceiling. Kale sprinted down the corridor, Lyra close behind, their boots slipping on the metal grating. Behind them, the hiss of Draxon plasma rifles grew louder. Docks, this way. Moore wheezed, veering left. The old scientist moved faster than Kale expected, his coat flapping like ragged wings. They burst into the docking bay, just as a squad of Draxon enforcers rounded the far corner. Kale didn't stop to think. He raised the rifle Moore had given him and fired. The shot took the lead enforcer in the throat, sending the others scrambling for cover. Go, he barked, shoving Lyra toward their stolen freighter. Moore hesitated at the ramp. I'm not coming with you. What? Kale snarled. They'll kill you. They'll do worse if they catch me with you. Moore tossed him a small data chip. Everything I know about the brand. If you survive, find the others. What others? Lyra demanded. Moore's smile was grim. You'll know. Then he turned and ran, not away from the Draxon, but toward them. Kale didn't wait to see what happened next. He slammed his palm on the hatch controls, sealing them inside, as the freighter's engines roared to life. The last thing he saw through the viewport was Moore standing in the center of the bay, arms raised, as the Draxon closed in. The ship lurched as it detached, throwing Kale into the pilot's seat. He gripped the controls, forcing the freighter into a steep climb. Behind them, the station erupted in flames. Lyra sank into the co-pilot's chair, her hands trembling. He sacrificed himself. Yeah, Kale said tightly. Now let's make sure it wasn't for nothing. He plugged in the data chip. A holographic display flickered to life. Star charts, genetic sequences, and a single name. Project Unshackled. What is this? Lyra whispered. A rebellion, Kale realized. Moore wasn't just studying the brand. He was breaking it. For others like you. A proximity alarm blared. Kale's stomach dropped as 3 Draxon interceptors dropped out of warp behind them. Hold on. He wrenched the controls, sending the freighter into a spiraling dive. Plasma bolts streaked past the view screen. One grazed their hull, sending sparks flying from the console. Lyra's hands flew over the nav computer. There's a nebula ahead. If we can reach it, we might lose them. Might. Kale gritted his teeth. I hate might. The freighter shuddered as another blast hit. Warning lights flashed across the dashboard. Shields at 20%. Then, a new signal on the comms. Kale, you always did pick the worst escape routes. Kal's blood ran cold. Joran, a sleek fighter, dropped into formation beside them, its guns blazing. The lead Draxan interceptor exploded in a fireball. Miss me. Joran's voice was laced with static. You sold us out. Kale snapped. Had to make it convincing. Joran said. Now shut up and follow my lead. The remaining interceptors broke off as Joran's fighter streaked ahead, weaving through the asteroid field. Kale hesitated only a second before following. You trust him? Lyra asked. No, Kale said, but I trust him to save his own skin. Joran led them to a derelict cruiser, its hull pocked with age. They docked in silence. The moment the hatch opened, Kale had his pistol leveled at Joran's chest. Talk, fast. Joran didn't flinch. I'm not Draxan. Never was. I've been working with Moore for years. Bullshit, Kale spat. I saw the bounty chip in your head. Joran tapped the implant. Fake. Had to make the Draxan believe I was theirs. He glanced at Lyra. Moore told you about the others. Lyra nodded slowly. Project Unshackled. Then you know this isn't just about you, Joran said. There are hundreds like you. Thousands. And the Draxan are hunting every last one. Kale lowered the gun slightly. Why? Because the brand doesn't just mark slaves. Lyra realized. It controls them. Joran's smile was grim. And you, Calveric, just broke their system. Outside, the distant rumble of engines echoed through the derelict ship. They're coming, Joran said. Time to choose, run or fight. Kale looked at Lyra. Her eyes burned with something he'd never seen before. Hope. He chambered around in his pistol. We fight. The derelict cruiser's engines groaned as Kale pushed them beyond safety limits. Behind them, the Draxan fleet emerged from warp. A dozen ships, their hulls gleaming like knives in the dark. Joran's voice crackled over the comm. They've locked onto us. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they're in firing range. Cal's hands tightened on the controls. Then we make those minutes count. He turned to Lyra. Moore's data. Any idea where these other marked prisoners are held? Her fingers flew over the holographic display. Here. The Draxan Processing Facility on Krill IV. It's a hub for newly captured slaves before they're branded. Joran's fighter banked sharply alongside them. That's a suicide run. That facility's guarded by half their fleet. Good, Kale said, teeth bared in something too sharp to be a smile. Then they won't expect us. The plan was insanity. Kale knew it. Lyra knew it. Even Joran, who'd spent years playing double agent, looked like he wanted to strangle them both. But it was all they had. They'd use the derelict cruiser as a battering ram, crash it into the facility's shield generator. Joran would create a distraction with his fighter, and Kale and Lyra. They'd walk right through the front door. Remember, Joran said as they prepped the cruiser's autopilot, the moment that shield drops, every Draxan in the system will come running. Kale checked his stolen rifle. Let them. Lyra touched his arm. Her brand, though dimmed, still pulsed faintly. If this works. It'll work, Kale said. He didn't let himself think about the alternative. The impact was louder than Kale expected. One moment, the facility's shields glowed blue and impenetrable. The next, fire, debris, chaos. Alarms wailed as they sprinted through the smoke-filled corridors. Around them, Draxan guards scrambled, shouting in their guttural tongue. Kale didn't hesitate. He shot anything that moved. Lyra led the way, her steps sure. This way. The holding cells are below us. They found the prisoners in a cavernous chamber, hundreds of them. Aliens of every species, crammed into cages. Some already bore the faint glow of fresh brands. Others stared with hollow eyes, waiting for their turn. The sight hit Kel like a punch to the gut. Lyra didn't freeze. She moved to the nearest control panel, her fingers flying. "I can override the locks, but..." A plasma bolt seared past her head. Kel spun, firing. The Draxan officer collapsed, but more poured in behind him. Lyra almost got it. The cages hissed open. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a roar. The prisoners surged forward, a tidal wave of rage and desperation. The Draxan didn't stand a chance. The facility burned behind them as they fled to the docks, freed slaves streaming in their wake. Joran's fighter circled overhead, picking off pursuing Draxan ships. "We need a ship," Kel shouted over the din. Lyra pointed. There. A Draxan transport, its engines humming as it prepared for emergency takeoff. They sprinted, Kel firing at the guards on the ramp. They barely made it. The ship lurched as it took off, throwing Kel against the wall. Lyra grabbed the controls, her hand steady despite the chaos. "Where to now?" she asked. Kel looked at her, at the freed prisoners crammed into the hold behind them, at the stars stretching endlessly ahead. "Everywhere," he said. Epilogue. The message spread faster than anyone expected. A human and an alien girl tearing down the Draxan's prized facility. The brand broken. The slaves freed. On 100 worlds, the marked raised their heads. And for the first time in centuries, they fought back.